Hello and thanks for joining us at interest.co.nz. I'm Janata Turani and today I'm discussing the ban of new offshore oil and gas exploration with the Energy and Resources Minister, Megan Woods. Thanks for your time, Minister.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Right, we'll crack straight into it and talk about gas first. 14% of New Zealand's energy needs are met by gas. We produce all the gas we use. Minister, you've said that our natural gas supply could be depleted as soon as 2025. Do you believe 7 years is enough time for us to reduce nearly all our demand for gas?
Look, in terms of New Zealand's, the quality assured estimates that MB put out, the 2017 figure is 10 years. I think one of the things that we have to bear in mind that what we're talking about here is a very long-term managed transition. We're talking about honouring all the existing exploration permits, and we've got 100,000 square kilometres of those that are currently permitted. So we would expect within those 100,000 kilometres that there will be additional fines within that period.
Okay, so the thing is though that cannot be guaranteed. So worst case scenario, and this is a worst case scenario, is that in 10 years time we will have depleted the gas that we currently have. So are you certain that we have other energy to replace the supply that would be left open by gas?
Well, look, nothing has changed in terms of that certainty because of the announcement we made. If we take what the industry would estimate around 10 to 15% likelihood of finding a discovery, that's 10 to 15,000 square kilometres that could potentially be in production. That's nearly 10 times as much as currently in production offshore.
Okay, so the difference though is, and I know you don't quite agree with this, but the difference is in confidence. You know, if you are a company, before you invest a lot of money in a new country, in a new project, or perhaps you might already be working here, but before you invest in a new project, you need some certainty. And if you know that the government is not on board, then that's a whole lot of instability. So I guess that there might be reduced confidence. You have to accept that.
Look, one of the things that I think is really important here is that we've sent a very long-term signal around what the future over the, beyond the 30, 40 year is. That what we absolutely need to make sure now that investors understand is that the conditions of those permits, as they stand, will remain unchanged. Nothing is different in terms of exploration permits than it was a month ago. So that's one of the things that I'm absolutely critically focusing on now as the Minister.
Okay, right. So you've said that, but in terms of that supply, what evidence do you have that it be commercially viable for other sources of energy, for their production to be ramped up within the next few years to replace what's left open by gas?
Sure, look, I'll come to that, but just one other point I want to make around those existing permits in terms of the likelihood of them being able to be fulfilled from exploration to mining permits. And in terms of the economics, if there is going to be a resource there that can be exploited, there will be people that want to take advantage of that. People have spent a lot of money getting to this point already with some likelihood. So we have no reason to expect they won't be exploited. In terms of what we need to do to fill that gap over the 30, 40, 50-year horizon and what other sources will come in to fill that. I think one of the things that the Productivity Commission's report that came out, the draft report that came out last Friday, had some really interesting analysis in there in terms of it. Of course, at the moment, having the overcapacity of renewables simply isn't economic in terms of delivering the security of supply we need at affordable rates. But what it's saying is the fact that New Zealand can produce some of the cheapest wind energy in the world means that actually having the overcapacity as prices continue to fall around that sector becomes more and more likelihood over the time frames we're talking about. And I think that's one of the things that we have to bear in mind. If we think back to where technology was 10 years ago, let alone 20 or 30, we're in a very different place today than we will be 10, 20, 30 years in the future. And it is about that long-term managed transition, looking ahead beyond the 3-year political cycle. 30 years down the track.
Sure. And we all agree with that. So if we take wind for an example, what projections do you have? Firstly, I don't have this off the top of my head, but in terms of our energy needs, how much of that is met by wind currently, and what projections do we have for how that can be ramped up in 10, 20, 30 years? What are the numbers around this?
So one of the things that we have is we have a lot of capacity in wind that is already consented, that hasn't been built. And one of the decisions that we've seen come out in the last few days that I think is really helpful in terms of providing that long-term stability and signal that the market needs about whether or not it's going to capitalise on those consents and build more capacity is, of course, the decision around Tiwai. I think a lot of the people that had those consents were waiting to see whether or not there was going to be a continuation of that contract, because of course if there wasn't, 15% more hydro capacity would have come into the electricity market, so that there was a huge amount of uncertainty that existed there with providers. So I know from talking to people that they say that that's a bit of a game changer, that not only the decision around turning on the fourth pot down at Tiwai, but the fact that it sends a longer term signal about the commitment that we're going to continue to produce this aluminium down in Southland.
Okay.
One of the reasons why it's so keen to produce that aluminium down at Tiwai Point is because it's produced by renewable energy. It means that it can get a premium in a commodity market.
Okay, so
because there's not many places in the world that can do that.
Okay, well that's great, but what portion of our current energy is produced by wind?
Oh, look, like you, I don't have that number right in front of me, but we can get that through to you.
Okay, but so this is the problem, is that we need to have some concrete figures around the speed and the extent at which some of these energy sources can be scaled up, because we all agree that we need them and they need to be ramped up, but we need to have some, some research that shows how quickly that can happen.
Oh, and look, that research, those numbers exist. I just don't happen to have me in front of me like you don't. Okay. I mean, we're certainly able to get that through to you, and you'll be able to put that alongside the interview.
Okay, thank you. And just like in terms of some of the other forms of energy, how do you have certainty around the extent at which that production can be ramped up when you haven't consulted with some of the main industry groups before you made this decision on the offshore oil and gas ban?
Oh, look, these are conversations that we've been having for a long time around what capacity there is in New Zealand. Like wind, actually there's a lot of consented but unrealised hydrothermal capacity as well. And I think geothermal is one of the huge strategic advantages that New Zealand exists and has into the 21st century, that we see other countries that are blessed with this resource that are making huge gains from doing it. We see that Iceland's built a whole economic development strategy around things like producing aluminium from its geothermal reserve, that it's also doing a lot of research and started some production around making methanol from its geothermal feedstock, so that we have consented capacity that we are yet to realise in the central North Island, which is also where we know a lot of the capacity has to go in the 21st century. One of the problems we have with our energy system in New Zealand is that we generate a whole lot of our electricity in the South Island and we consume it in the North Island. So that I think what renewables gives us is the option to actually put some of that capacity closer to where it's going to be used and where our centres of population are.
Okay, so that sounds great. And the problem I think that some people might have is that we just have to take your word for it. You've said it, and that's all we have. We don't have a big report like the Productivity Commission's 500-page report that details some of the stuff. Why didn't you sort of have a bigger consultation process to put it all out for the public and take them with you? All we have is your word now.
Look, I think one of the things, I think there's quite a misunderstanding around what transitions planning is. Transitions planning wasn't turning up on the day with a glossy document, slapping it on the table and saying, here's the future. Transitions planning is about governments putting in place the resource so that we can work beside the people on the ground who this is going to affect to make the best decisions that we can about the 30, 40, 50-year horizons. Look, I've just been through the last 7 or 8 years in Christchurch where we had to embrace change pretty quickly. And I know that the things that have worked, not when central governments rolled into town and said, here's the future, like it, that they've put in place the resource to work beside local communities and make sure that that local knowledge is being utilised and well resourced. So one of the things that we have done, that I announced at the petroleum conference when I spoke there, is that we'd instructed MB to start setting up a transitions unit. That work is progressing very quickly. There is a team inside MB that will be able to work on the ground beside local communities to capitalise on things like the Taranaki Action Plan.
How many
which
people
some
in the
fantastic
team?
ideas.
How many people
How many people in the team? Look, it's the team that will bring together the energy thinking, the research, science and innovation. It will bring together the workforce planning, the regional and economic development, as well as interfacing with the Ministry of Education.
Okay. Minister, in terms of working alongside people on the ground, this afternoon I spoke to the Bioenergy Association's head, Brian Cox, and he was disappointed because the government had not actually spoken to him, and he represents a great form of a cleaner energy about the transition, and he reckons there are a whole bunch of solutions, sort of low-hanging fruit solutions that could be implemented, but he hasn't had contact with you. What he also says is a study that the association commissioned found that 60% of our energy, 60% of the energy that's currently supplied by coal can be replaced by bioenergy, right? So, but the thing is that coal only makes up 5% of our energy needs. So 60% of 5% can be currently done with bioenergy. In terms of the role that bioenergy can play in replacing some of the gas, we're still a long way off, aren't we?
Oh, absolutely. It has a role to play. And actually, I launched that report. That's right. The report that Scion did, and went and had a really great conversation with a number of people that had taken part in putting together that research. But as you say, that it's a small part, but it's a really important part. And the thing is that what we have to realise is that actually New Zealand's competitive advantage in the 21st century is about the mix of renewables that we can bring. Other countries are having to rely on single sources to really provide the heft to it. That we have so much diversity in terms of that we have the hydro, we've got geothermal, which is quite a unique resource, that we have huge capacity in wind and can produce it some of the cheapest in the country. And of course the work that this government is committed to doing around forestry actually does potentially produce quite a waste stream that can be used in a as the biomass that is needed for biofuel.
Right. Minister, if we talk now about emissions specifically, what are your projections around the extent to which our carbon emissions will be reduced if we substitute gas with various forms of cleaner energy? What are some of the studies that have been done to show the actual impact on emissions?
Yeah, well, in terms of what we have now, I think we divide this into three parts. There's what we know now in terms of current mining permits that have been quantified. There's the exploration permits, which is still a bit of an unknown, and then there's an even bigger unknown, and is what we're not going to be offering for further exploration permits. So I think what we can say in terms of the ability to calculate emissions reductions because of our policy decision not to offer further offshore exploration permits, that's impossible because it's an unknown. But what we can do is have a look at the proportion of our emissions that come from the energy sector in New Zealand at the moment. We can break that down further, that those energy emissions are broken down in terms of electricity, transport and industrial heat.
Okay, so how much
three main ways to do it. So, but what we know is what gas takes up there. So 39% of our emissions in there that we can start to calculate out the tonnage that we'll be able to remove. And that is exactly what the Independent Climate Commission will be doing with its carbon budgets.
Look, I just want to talk now about the Productivity Commission's report that they released. And this was a report, a 500-page long report outlining New Zealand's transition to a lower carbon economy. 500 pages, it didn't mention stopping oil and gas exploration.
Look, I actually think the chapters that it has around energy are really interesting, and particularly around the industrial heat. One of the passages, which I think is on page 350, I have worked my way through it, is actually around talking about the use of gas as a transition away from coal for industrial heat users. It points to the fact that there's no reticulated gas in the South Island. It points to the fact that there's only very limited parts of the North Island that has reticulated gas where that can actually be an option. And it sounds a very strong warning, which is something that's been top of my mind, that if we need to send those strong investment signals to our major energy users, or they risk ending up with stranded assets.
Sure.
And I think that's where the world, and that's certainly where Mark Carney from the Bank of England is really talking about that. He talks about the need that if we're going to reach the Paris goals, 1.5 to 2 degree limiting to that, that actually 80% of what is known now can't be mined, and he is really worried about the effect on balance sheets and stranded assets.
Okay.
I just do need to. I think we're at time now. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Can I just ask you a couple more questions?
One more.
Right. Okay, look, I just wanted to pick up on the Productivity Commission, some of its recommendations, and this is if we turn to oil now. One of its suggestions to increase the uptake of electric vehicles is introducing a fee-based scheme. So this means importers would either pay a fee or receive a rebate depending on the emissions intensity or fuel efficiency of imported vehicles. What do you think about this idea?
Oh, look, for me, I've always said that I think one of the most important things in terms of getting more New Zealanders into electric vehicles is actually around addressing how we feed our second-hand car markets. I think that that's really important. New Zealanders buy their cars second-hand, and I think one of the most important things we can turn our attention to is procurement and fleet purchasing in terms of making sure that we have affordable electric vehicles available for people to buy. The fee-bate is a suggestion from the Productivity Commission. It's not government policy, but there's a range of levers that governments can use. And for me, personally, it is very much about working to the way in which New Zealanders choose their cars, and that's down at the second-hand car lot.